Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about subtracting real numbers. So real numbers, remember, are numbers that you use in everyday life or can use in your everyday life, whether it be in your regular life or in some type of career. And you'll use addition and subtraction throughout your everyday life. There's so many examples of that. So addition and subtraction do go together, and you can use it for money, measurements of any material, whether it be wood, metal, or anything else. Things like calories, miles. There's so many other examples. So I'm sure you could think of many, many other examples where you'd add and subtract in your everyday life, but that's why it's so important. And you might say, well, Mr. Pippage, my app does that for me. Well, that's true, but if you don't track it yourself, a lot of times you're gonna run into a lot of issues, especially with things like money. You want to make sure you're tracking that yourself. Not so much calculating yourself, but when you have to check something, then you want to calculate yourself because trust me, guys, these programs they have issues. That's why I have to call businesses sometimes and correct the issue that happens because these programs do have issues. So just because things are automated in everyday lives doesn't mean you won't add or subtract. Okay. And even sports use adding and subtracting throughout to determine like total yards or points scored, whatever it may be. So many examples where you would add or subtract. So when you're talking about subtracting, the major rule is called add the opposite. Okay? And you only really want to apply adding the opposite when you have other examples besides basic subtraction. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. Although you could apply adding the opposite. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to apply it though. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. But when you're applying the rule adding the opposite with subtraction, you have to change two things. Okay? So you have to change the subtraction sign in between the numbers to an addition sign and change the sign of the second number. Okay, so whatever that sign is, the second number, you're going to change the sign or make it the opposite. When you're applying adding the opposite, first number never changes. So never change the sign of the first number. So you change the subtraction sign in between the two numbers, and then you change the sign of the second number. Okay? And although it says down here that all subtraction problems need to be changed, most do. If it's basic subtraction, which would be a large positive minus a smaller positive, you really don't need to apply adding the opposite, although you can. But anything else, especially working with negative numbers, or if you have a smaller positive minus a larger positive, you definitely want to apply the adding the opposite rule to help you get the right answer. So again, as I mentioned earlier, with basic subtraction, it really doesn't make sense to apply adding the opposite. So when you have a larger number minus a smaller number, again, just subtract the two numbers. So for example, 8 minus 5 is 3. It doesn't make a lot of sense for that example to apply adding the opposite. So we're not going to change two things to do that problem. And the same thing is true here. 45 minus 27. Well, again, you may need to borrow from the 4. Okay, make that a 3, then make the 5 a 15. If you set this up vertically, you might need to do that, right? Something like that. So you might have to borrow to do that if you're not using a calculator. But again, we have a larger positive minus a smaller positive. So it doesn't make sense to apply that adding the opposite rule. All right. The same thing is true with that example. And again, you might have to set that up vertically because you have to borrow a little bit. There's a nice little trick there, though. Maybe I'll show you the trick really quick. Again, we're not talking about adding the opposite rule. We're talking about a little trick with subtraction, right? So it's 108 minus 49. Well, instead of doing all the borrowing, right, I could do 108 minus 50, which would be 1 larger, right? So 49 making 1 larger, making it 50. Well, 108 minus 50, most people could do that in their head, right? That's 58. And again, you could borrow. But then since we added 1 to 49, we'd add 1 to this answer and make it 59. So that's pretty cool, right? It's a little trick you can do sometimes if you have trouble borrowing. If I increase that number by 1, I would increase my final answer by 1. But anyways, basic subtraction, no need to apply the adding the opposite rule. Now, here's an example where you're going to apply adding the opposite rule, and I'm going to show you with the marker. So basically what you do is the first number you never change, -6. You change the subtraction sign to an addition, so I make this addition. And then I change the sign of the second number. Well, right now it's positive, so I make that negative. okay? And now you're using your rules for addition. So once you make the problem into addition, now you use your rules for addition. Adding two negatives stays negative. So negative 13. Okay? 1 second. So again, we made the minus sign into a plus, right? We made that 7 negative. And now we're using our rules for addition. Negative 13. Let's look at this example. And I'll write on it so you can see. We have negative 34 minus 14, right? Well, what we do, we never change the first number. Kind of went away here. We never change the first number. We change the minus sign in between the numbers to an addition, make it addition. And now we change the sign of this number. So it becomes a positive 14, right? Well, since we're adding, and that's just erasing back. Now, since we're adding now, the new problem is negative 34 plus 14. You use your rules for addition. So once you make the problem to addition, you use your rules for addition you just learned. And since the problem is negative 34 plus 14, you subtract your two numbers, right? And then keep the sign of the larger number. So if I subtract 34 minus 14, we get 20. But then we keep the sign of the larger number, which is the negative 34. So I make our final answer negative. Okay? And again, that will be reviewed right here. We made the minus sign to a plus, make that negative 14 to a positive 14. And now, once you make the subtraction problem to addition and you change those two things, you're using your rules for addition. Subtract the two numbers, and then keep the sign of the larger number. Okay? So adding the opposite, you got to change two signs. The subtraction sign in between, and the sign of the second number. So 8 minus negative 13. Well, again, that minus sign in between is going to become a positive, right? And the negative 13 is going to become a positive. So once you do that, this problem becomes extremely easy. Add the opposite. Now you're just adding two positive numbers. That's great. So 8 plus 13 is 21. Finally, our last example, 6 minus 24. Now this isn't basic subtraction because the first number is smaller than the second number. Okay, so we're taking away a larger number. So you do want to apply adding the opposite though. We make the minus sign to a plus, and now that 24 becomes negative. And since we're adding a positive and a negative, right, we subtract and then keep the sign of the larger number, which will be negative, right? So 24 minus 16, that's an ugly 4. 24 minus 16 is 18. You might have to borrow there. But then we make our final answer negative because 24 is bigger than 6, so we keep that sign. Okay, and the reviewed right there. The minus sign becomes a plus, 24 becomes negative. And now we subtract, we're using our rules for addition, subtract, because we're adding a positive and negative, keep the sign of that negative 24, negative 18, because 24 is larger than 6. All right? All right, so go ahead and try all these examples then in your notes using the adding the opposite rule without a calculator. Okay? So go ahead at this point, pause the video, try these examples on your own, and see how you do. The next 30 seconds will be blank. When you're done, please restart the video. Okay, so hopefully you tried these all on your own. That's an important part of learning. And here's all the answers. Okay, so number 1, negative 5 minus 13. That's going to be negative 18. Okay, reason why? Just to go over a couple of these. I'm not going to go over every single one. But the minus sign becomes a plus, right? 13 becomes negative. So it's like adding two negative numbers. $180 minus 91. Well, that's basic subtraction. You could apply the adding the opposite rule, so if you did, you still would have got this answer. But since this is basic subtraction, I wouldn't recommend it. And there's a little trick here. Watch this. If I round that 91 to 90, well, I made this number 1 less, didn't I? Well, I can just subtract the two numbers. Disappears this pen tool. I can just subtract the two numbers and then make my answer one less. So I get 90 here, and then make my answer one less since I made this number one less. Final answer is 89. Cool little trick there. Anyways, 89. The next one, leave the negative 13 alone. Make the minus 13 or minus sign into a plus sign, and make the 14 into a positive, right? So now, because we're adding a positive and a negative, we subtract the two numbers and keep the sign of the larger number. So when we subtract and keep the sign of the larger number, it's going to be a positive 1 because the 14 is the largest number. And finally, the last one, 56 minus a negative 8. So we want to make the minus sign into a plus sign, the negative 8 into a positive 8, and now we're just adding two positive numbers. Okay? So 56 plus 8 is 64. Here's the rest of the remaining answers, so you can check to see how you did. Again, these are just the final answers. All right? Number 7 was an addition problem. And that's a good one to go over really quick. Why did I throw that in there? The point I want to make with addition is we don't change the actual problem within addition. We do change these to do it, right? We change this. Actually, these two were addition, excuse me. But we don't change the actual problem. We just apply our rules for addition. So for number 6, we're adding two negatives. Add them up and keep it negative. Number 7, we're adding a positive and a negative. So you actually subtract off to the side of your problem and then keep the sign of the larger number. Right? So I threw those on there to make a point that you do not change anything within the problem for addition. You change within the problem for subtraction, okay? But not for addition like 6 and 7. All right? So hopefully you found this video lesson helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a fantastic day, everybody.